Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Good morning to our panel. You're finding yourself in the room of the panel of Governance and Regulation of AI from the perspective of autonomy and privacy. It's a great privilege and a pleasure to be here in person. Although we managed to organize a hybrid panel, as you can see, we have adopted to the new normal of post-COVID times. Today, we have a wonderful panel put together that is discussing, I think, very pertinent issues surrounding the governance and regulation of AI. The EU has become a global player in the field of AI regulation. Specifically with the new AI Act, it adds another layer of regulation to data protection and other instruments of the European Union. But to assess the exact impact of AI regulation is yet to be done, and specifically when it comes to sectoral approaches of AI regulation. So in order to understand what a holistic regulation would entail, it is important to take a look at specific sectors that are dealing or that are affected by such a regulation. Today with me are Lynette Taylor, Tilburg Law School, who will join us online, Elisabeth Coombs, independent consultant, Vincent Boitou, IDEMIA, and Oskar Gstrein, Campus Fryslân, University of Groningen. My name is Andre Zwitter. I'm also from the University of Groningen. I'll be chairing this session. The topics that we will be discussing today, as I mentioned, are really at the center, despite the fact that they are sectoral, they are at the center of when it comes to the regulation of AI and to the protection of the individual and of people as a whole. So the first question that we will be addressing and that Lynette will address specifically centers around group interests, group privacy, and the question of abnormal justice. A second question, just as important, will be tackled by Elisabeth, namely, what are the governance mechanisms to mitigate automated stigmatization and discrimination related to gender? Vincent will deal with the question of live facial recognition and what does this mean for an evolvement of a new public space, and should, very importantly, have the police the freedom to test biometric technologies in real-life settings. And last but certainly not least, Oskar will deal with the questions surrounding design and deployment of predictive policing techniques and how they are affected by the new EU AI Act. And without further ado, I'll give the floor to Lynette Taylor, who will discuss the questions surrounding group interest, group privacy, and abnormal justice. And can we switch to the online part of this session? Welcome.
Hi, can everyone hear me? Good morning. Thanks for the introduction, Andre. I wish I was there in Brussels. Unfortunately, I can't be there today, but thank you for letting me join online. So what Andre and Oskar have asked me to talk about today is something that came out through a collaboration we've been working on, a book which will be coming out later this year. It's some work I've been doing on the difference between thin conceptualizations of responsibility with respect to AI and more complex, thick versions of responsibility, and what that tells us about justice and democratic governance of the technologies involved. I think that we've all been aware of the problems that have come up for compliance-based responsibility, which is how I would characterize maybe the last 10 years of thinking about responsibility in AI. The repurposing of data along its long life cycle and the de-identification of data in particular means that being responsible with AI makes demands that go way beyond compliance now. and that the fields developing AI are not fully equipped to deal with those demands. Brent Mittelstadt has written an excellent paper called Beyond Principles, where he defines some demands that specifically come into play with governing AI, which are not being met yet. One is a common understanding of ethics and norms in the field. The second is fiduciary duties being established and clear. The third is having norms regarding human subjects. And the fourth is robust accountability mechanisms. And when we think about that, we realize that the fields engaged in developing and deploying AI don't have this kind of history. They don't have the same history as lawyers, as doctors do. They don't have these common understandings in place, which makes for a very difficult basis for a thicker concept of responsibility that can deal with the way AI affects its human subjects. So one of the things that we think about with regard to this is group privacy, is the notion that de-identified data still has effects. And I think this has become much clearer over the last 5 years as AI has come into the picture. When we talked about group privacy with regard to big data, it was mostly with a view to legitimacy issues, legitimacy of intervention on population levels. And that is really what comes up with AI. It's not just about privacy and confidentiality anymore. It's about the freedom to act on large groups of people based on data which cannot be traced necessarily back to individuals, but where the data that flows from an individual will end up impacting them through processes of public policy, of private sector-based intervention, or a mix of the two. And so we wind up having to think about not just group privacy really, but group intervention as a problem of AI that we are ill-equipped to deal with because we tend to function through a privacy lens, legally speaking. So the philosopher Nancy Fraser helps us with this a little bit with some work she did about 10 years ago on the notion of abnormal justice. And a lot of social justice groups working on data use this framing. I'm borrowing this specifically from Sita Peña-Gangadharan at LSE, but she brought up Fraser's notion of abnormal justice because it encapsulates a lot of the problems we see with AI right now. One is that justice has shifted from a local to a transnational framing, where we're often talking about tech firms, particularly that operate across regions and across borders. This means that the subjects and the interests involved can be local, which we're well equipped to deal with our existing legal frameworks, but can also be much, much broader. They can even be global. When we talk about large ID systems, for instance, or COVID tracking technologies or COVID certification technologies, we see something which turns into something with global implications, but starts off with local compliance requirements. And that's become very problematic. So we have geography changing, we have interests changing, we have the subjects of justice claims changing as well, going from individuals to collectives a lot of the time. And we also, importantly, have the social cleavages that justice claims relate to changing as well. They've gone beyond economic questions of distribution and redistribution and changed into issues to do with gender, beyond what we would have recognized as gender questions even 10 or 20 years ago, ethnicity, location, deprivation. There are all sorts of issues that we are really ill-equipped to deal with in our current legal and even, honestly, fundamental rights framework, which demands that we know what vulnerability looks like ahead of time, ahead of applying the technology. This has become really problematic. We saw this with Timnit Gebru's claims about the AI that Google was developing, large language models. This is an excellent example of demand based on justice issues. Timnit and a bunch of colleagues at Google wrote a paper saying that large language models were unfair for several reasons, which current fairness thinking cannot cover. One was that they have massive environmental impacts, which are necessarily borne by people who do not benefit from the computational technologies involved. These are the least connected people and the least rich and well-off people. And so they will suffer the climate impacts of these models. And second, that you cannot make the models fair and accurate because the internet itself, from which they feed on to learn language and to reproduce it, is not fair and not unbiased. And so she says that unbiasing the AI is never going to help we live in a biased and unfair world, and that when we magnify that with large language models, we amplify it to an extent that becomes unacceptable. And so a justice claim has to deal with the people who cannot be seen from the framing of the original technological design. It has to deal with everyone out there, both from a climate perspective and from an overall justice perspective. And this is very problematic. So I will finish by saying there are a couple of ways we might address this. One is by moving from a redistribution and compliance framework to a framework of recognizing and representing different interests, which may not be immediately recognizable for the point at which we start designing or even governing a technology. The second is the notion of decentering the technology, as Timnit Gebru's claims do, and looking at the broader justice claims rather than those that we can pin down as AI ethics claims. And the last is that democracy, as we currently have it, even in democratic states, is not really equipped to deal with these problems of justice. And we need to look to a more agonistic politics of justice, where we can have people existing on different ends of the spectrum, coexisting within a single democratic debate. Whereas currently, people who radically disagree or refuse get shut out. We need to explore what it means to be inclusive of protest in our debates, and especially in legal and governance debates, which we are not remotely equipped to do currently. They're extremely centrist in terms of who gets included. And so we need to rethink governance to include people who are considered outside because they are protesters. And that is a challenge that is going to affect us all over the coming 5 to 10 years, and that we need to be better equipped to deal with. And with that, I will end. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Elizabeth. I think you are asking some very fundamental questions that we would like to address later also during the Q&A session. We'll bring Lynette back again at the end. So if you would like to keep your questions for the end, we'll collect them at that point. But the questions were really pointed, and I think with regard to interest groups and group perspectives, I think we have the perfect segue to our next speaker, Elizabeth. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you.
Hello.
There we go. Before I start, I want to acknowledge my co-author on this issue, Halafom Abraham, a postdoctoral researcher at the Benevaro Institute of Human Rights at Oxford University, and to thank both Andre and Oscar for organizing this panel and including gender in the discussion of AI governance. But of course also to thank yourselves for joining us, because these are very important issues and ones which are not necessarily part of the mainstream conversation. Actually, let's start. Stay there, go back. Thanks. I was getting ahead of myself there. It's now generally accepted that gender affects how we experience our lives, how we live our lives, and moreover, how they actually impact upon our enjoyment of our human rights. Similarly, it's also widely accepted that in the virtual world, the enjoyment of privacy and other human rights is determined to a large extent by our gender, and we experience the benefits of digital technologies differently according to gender. In terms of discrimination, if I could put this in a nutshell, and very broadly, I do admit that, but I am an Australian and we tend to be a bit colourful and to the point. We know that AI is more likely to discriminate to the detriment of those who are not white, who are not cisgendered, who are not straight males from the global north. So it's now common to discuss gender and AI in terms of discrimination and stigmatisation. But have we been thinking seriously enough, sufficiently enough, and comprehensively enough about incorporating those gender issues in AI governance? These issues, about AI, governance, privacy, autonomy, and gender are big issues, and I know that I'm not doing justice to all of those components. But I just want to make a couple of sort of linkages here. The link between the right to privacy and gender has been established. In 1994, in the United Nations Human Rights Committee in Tunen versus Australia, determined that private, consensual, same-sex relations between adults was a matter of privacy. In 2017, the committee reiterated that the right to privacy governs or concerns gender identity. In terms of autonomy, the right to privacy and reproductive autonomy, for example, are frequently linked. For example, where the right to reproductive privacy, the right to privacy serves as the constitutional foundation of reproductive rights, as in the United States. But also, of course, due to the vast amount of data which is collected. Think of personal data used in health apps, dating apps, wellness and fitness apps, let alone femtech and sextech, data which is now available and being used in AI systems in ways which we don't always know and can't actually pin down. I want to make an important distinction between governance of gender and gender governance. They are not the same, and I'm concentrating today more upon gender governance and how that needs to be placed in terms of AI governance. I am, though, very interested in talking to anyone who is interested in following up on AI and governance of gender after the session. So, autonomy. A very important aspect of the right to privacy is the space it creates for us to develop ourselves, to know who we are, and to actually sort of experiment with an expression of ourselves. Both physical and virtual infringements upon privacy affect autonomy and other rights critical to self-development, such as the right to freedom of expression, of association, of practicing one's beliefs and religions, a variety of very important matters for development of self. And we accept that AI technologies are not only technologically based, but are socially and culturally conditioned. They develop out of societal as well as technological and commercial contexts to meet, as I was indicating earlier, perceived needs and wants. So they are therefore capable of carrying forward existing prejudices, stereotypes, behaviours and ideas. And while empowering for many, for others it can be a very mixed, if not oppressive situation. But what are some of the points I want to put to you is, if AI discrimination places certain genders at a disadvantage and does this in a way which is opaque and difficult to challenge, to address, to rectify, does this not set some individuals and communities on a potentially ongoing treadmill of lesser status and opportunity? Does this, or could this, embedded disadvantage become correlated with concepts of unworthiness and unfitness? Think of previous centuries' notions of the deserving poor and the undeserving poor, notions which are used to rationalise inequities and to also mitigate and ignore their consequences. So my point here is the possibility is not just of automated and amplified prejudice, but one where AI can be used in disadvantaged ways for issues concerning gender. Argentina, for example, has used AI to predict teenage pregnancy and to target intervention. On the 1st of March this year, China's provisions on management of algorithmic recommendations in Internet information services came into effect. Among the provisions, there is a reported emphasis upon morality and societal well-being via provisions that order companies to uphold mainstream value orientations, vigorously disseminate positive energy, and to prevent or reduce controversies or disputes. And of course it does, it's still difficult to know whether those rules will impact upon the experience of gender, but it's one I think that's worthwhile us placing in our minds. So even in jurisdictions that do not explicitly criminalise same-sex activities, LGBTIQ communities and individuals experience harassment and sometimes far worse. And to summarise, my point here is that gender is simply far too important to be left out of discussions about AI governance. I'm just keeping a very close eye on the time because I know that Andre is a very strict moderator. So, now, AI systems already challenge existing regulation, both in data protection and anti-discrimination, as well as, on AI terms. And whilst we know that AI affects more than the right to privacy and anti-discrimination and equality, they are the frameworks we most frequently turn to prevent and rectify these impacts, these adverse impacts. But while helpful around the world, and remember I'm from the Southern Hemisphere, these frameworks have limited ability to address algorithmic gender effects for a number of reasons, such as scope. AI uses more than personal data, it uses non-personal data because of definitional issues, the hidden uses of AI, its opaqueness and difficult to pin down, the difficulties of actually establishing algorithmic discrimination as compared to algorithmic bias, and also the difficulties of determining the attribution of responsibility for their use and the adverse impacts, if any. So my point is, we need to consider, like AI systems, governance frameworks also reflect societal norms, and governance expresses what society and power structures think is important to regulate and what not to regulate. Now, if we just take abstract principles, for example, and I'm speaking here about sort of that gender blindness aspect, these are designed to be high level for maximum applicability, a good aim, obviously, but abstraction removes the social, political, and environmental materialities and concrete contexts and practices which are central to lived gender experience. In contrast, existing international human rights instruments, such as the ICCPR and the ICESCR, have a broader scope, and they also have long-standing established mechanisms, processes, and procedures that enable far greater courage. Accompanying some of those instruments have been supplements or guidelines which specifically address the application of gender in those circumstances. And I'm now just going to have to move along very promptly. The point I now will just move to is that an intersectional gender approach would frame regulation of AI technologies as systemic interventions, that is, purposeful action designed to create change in the setting of inclusive boundaries for marginalised groups and individuals. And such regulation could even accelerate the achievement of gender equality and equity. Now, some jurisdictions are actually doing that. They are using the concept of gender in their laws for a variety of purposes, mainly concerned around women and LGBTI communities. Not taking gender into account contradicts the reality that AI systems are neither neutral nor neutered. And so, not only do we need to advocate for AI regulation, we need to be advocating vigorously for its inclusion of gender governance in those frameworks. Not to do so is likely to perpetuate unequal social, political, cultural, and economic opportunities which are based upon gender. Thank you.
Thanks, Elizabeth. Gender, and you mentioned also the right and the freedom to your own expression and the space to develop yourself. And I think a particular space where you can do that is the public space. And that brings us, I'm trying to have a successful segue here, directly to Vincent and on facial recognition.
Thank you. I want to thank the organizers of the of the event, and obviously also my fellow panelists for having me here, and also the significant attendance that we can see today. IDEMIA is a European company developing biometric technology, including facial recognition. So I'm going to give you a very down-to-earth, somewhat descriptive speech about what it would mean to have facial recognition in live facial recognition in public spaces. So apologies to begin with. I'll be the lowly engineer of the group. How does this work? First, a biometric recognition system is designed to recognize people. So to recognize people, it needs to know them. So only people that are registered to the system in what I call here, but is the industry vernacular, the reference database, only the people whose biometric information sits in the reference database are eligible for being recognized by the system. And I'll talk a lot in the second part of my speech about what all this means in terms of governance and regulation. Another part is the live image acquisition that will be performed by a camera in a public space, if we're talking about public spaces. And the heart of the system is the biometric comparison engine, which will take biometric information acquired live by the cameras and compare that information to the stored information in the reference database. If the algorithms in the biometric comparison engine evaluate that an image coming from the live camera is an image of the same person, of one person in the reference database, then it will raise a notification that that person might be the person that is in the reference database. Then it will be taken for human review, where a human-faced examiner will compare the two images, the one that sits in the reference database and the one that elicited the notification that comes from the live camera, and decide, based on his experience and training, whether these two images are of the same person. And if he decides that these two images are of the same person, then that information needs to be taken to someone that will make a decision of what to do based on the information that that person that sits in the reference database is with high probability the person that has been passing in front of the camera. So all these different subsystems raise a lot of specific issues, so I'll try to be quick about them. If we talk about the reference database, and I really cannot stress this enough, I think this is the most important part that needs to be discussed about what we want to do with face recognition systems. Who is in the reference database? How they get there? How long they stay there? What would be the condition for them to get into it or out of it are absolutely crucial in the governance, in determining exactly what the systems will be able to do and what they won't be able to do. Because again, only the persons in the reference database can be recognized by the system. Then the devices that are used for live acquisition are also extremely important in terms of use case. They are basically defining the use case, right? Where do you take your data from to recognize people from? If it's a camera in a building, a camera in the street, it really depends on what the use case should be. The biometric comparison system is another important one whereby the fitness for purpose of this system is highly defined by its performance, right? We all know that facial recognition systems are not perfect. They make mistakes. What type of mistakes do they make? Do they have biases in the mistakes they made? Is probably one of the key discussion topics that we've had in the framework of the AI Act, and I think a very important one. So the industry has a duty to make sure that the algorithms that are put on the market are fit for purpose. Again, purpose pertaining to the use case. And then it's not over because once a facial examiner is presented with two images that are supposedly or potentially the same person, what is his training? How do he go about making that comparison? What are his standards for conclusion? You can't just say, based on my experience and training, I can say that these two images are from the same person or not. There needs to be standards for conclusion. It's a discussion that we've been having in the frame of fingerprint recognition, which I think needs to happen in facial recognition as well. And of course, the potentially harmful or at least impactful decision that will be made based on the fact that the person in front of the camera is believed to be the person in the reference database. That decision also depends highly on the use case and should be subject to governance. So overall, there are a lot of decisions to be made and systems to be put in place and regulation to be put in place for all of these to work in the sole benefit of society. Data acquisition governance in the reference database, again, that's the key. Who's in that reference database? Why are they here? And how do they get out of that reference database? The biometric comparison engine is almost the easiest part because there are a lot of technical standards that allow for measurement of errors, measurement of biases. Most of them already exist and have been existing for quite some time because they're just a derivation of what has been existing for fingerprint recognition for the last 50 years. But for biases, it's a bit more complex because all the demographic effects of a biometric algorithm needs to be taken into account, and standards are currently being developed to evaluate biases. Something which is really important is to know that that particular part, which is the part IDEMIA is providing, the biometric comparison engine, is subject to third-party testing, independent testing, as has been for quite some time, and is being thoroughly evaluated and publicly evaluated. Anybody can go and see what the performance of our algorithms and algorithms of the competition is. With regards to accuracy, with regards to demographic effects such as gender, I'm going to use the word because it's the word that is being used in the US where the evaluation is made, so ethnic group is the better word, gender, other demographic effects. All of that is being measured and monitored. And I just want to state that in 2019, the National Institute of Standards and Technology from the US Department of Commerce has been evaluating a number of algorithms, 300 different algorithms, if memory serves. And the best performing ones, NIST could not measure demographic impact, which means that they have the exact error rates for different demographic groups. They had the same error rates for men and women. They had the same error rates for different ethnic groups. They had the same error rates for different age groups, for example. Which does not mean that the overall system is unbiased. It just does mean that the bias that comes out of the biometric composite engine is measurable and under control. Now, even if all of this is done, quote unquote, correctly, oversight is very important in order to make sure that none of this is actually shifting on time. That the data governance governing the reference database remains applied and applicable, that the algorithm doesn't shift, and that all the, let's say, business process part, sorry for that word, but of human review and human decision remains compliant to the standards that have been defined to authorize this system. I'll just conclude by saying that, yes, law enforcement agencies should be allowed to test these systems in real-world settings because that's the only way we will know / establish whether the system can actually live up to everything that I've been describing in terms of being not prone to bias and being able to provide to fulfill their mission without creating discrimination. I'll just leave you with the last slide, which I'm not going to comment. There are a number of initiatives and resources from evaluation frameworks for live recognition. Most of them are highly interesting. They are pretty close, actually, and anyone interested in determining whether a given particular live facial recognition system, should be deployed can look at least 3 of these frameworks. There are many others. I just wrote here the one that we've been using. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Vincent. And you are a perfect example of a showcase that when you have self-regulation and it actually works, then you don't need regulation. But I think an area where we do need regulation, and I think an area that Oscar will touch upon, is the design and the deployment of predictive policing techniques. And I think the connection with facial recognition is very close here. So the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you, Andrew, very much, and thank you all for joining us today. I'm very pleased to present a couple of insights and observations from a project that I've been working on together with colleagues, including Andre, Anna Bunik, and others, which is called Cutting Crime Impact. It's an EU-funded research project that ran from 2018 and 2021. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about the design of the project, but first maybe shortly about myself. So my name, again, is Oscar Stein. I'm a researcher, assistant professor at Campus Fryslân, a colleague of Andre, and also a member of the Data Research Center there. And in this project, we were working together with 6 law enforcement agencies from all over Europe, in working on different topic areas. We call them focus areas, one of them being predictive policing, in the context what is called petty crime. So that in itself is a bit, or is a problematic term actually, because we found out during the research project that petty crime is not a harmonized term within Europe. And there's also some information available on how a new European security model could look in that regard. Which is available on the website, including all the other documentation also relating to this topic. And essentially, for the purpose of this presentation, it will suffice to say that petty crime is not terrorism and organized crime, so it's bicycle theft, burglaries, the everyday crime that you see sort of on the street. And as I said, this is a problematic discussion in itself, whether it is really petty or not, which we don't believe as a consortium, but another story. What I want to talk about now is predictive policing specifically, and there were 2 LEAs who were joining this project as having sort of a problem or wanting to develop their approaches to predictive policing further. And that is also generally the design and the thinking of the project, that there are those 6 LEAs, law enforcement agencies, and they have problems or issues that they would like to figure out. And then they work together with a consortium, including us, the Data Research Center, who had sort of the role of being, it's also a term that we can have a long discussion about, sort of a critical friend, thinking along when it comes to specifically ethical, legal, and social type of issues. You know, what are the governance principles which are there? How can human rights inform decisions? And the whole idea of the project was essentially to set up a design process which would then lead to developing a new solution, which we called in the context of the project a toolkit. And those 2 toolkits that we've been developing, you can see them here also on the slide. One is Patrol, which is the toolkit that the German police force, or regional police force in Lower Saxony developed, and the other one is ProHIC, which is the toolkit that was developed by the Dutch police. And that also brings me by the Dutch National Police, and that also brings me to a second point, which I think is really important when considering these developments and generally the development of AI-driven, informed, or where data plays a big role in training algorithms, etc. So where is the data coming from, right? So which type of data do we use? And typically, if we talk about predictive policing, the data that we are using is historic crime data. Now, that was very different for those 2 law enforcement agencies because, as I mentioned before, in the German case, we have a federal police force, Germany a federal state, so you have 16 different federal forces. And what you see there is that there is really a different type of data culture around which type of data to use and to train the systems and the algorithms, and it plays a very big role because in contrast on the Dutch side you have a tendency towards having everything on a national level, which then also comes that you're having much more access to data immediately, but also that there is much more of a tendency to merge that data with other existing data, such as from the statistics office, etc., right? And so you see that already has an impact on how you develop the system, on how you design the system, which types of functions you prefer and what. And both of those LEAs, they were actually in a very privileged sort of front-runner situation in a European setting, because the Dutch police already started developing their national crime anticipation system, which it is called, already in 2014, which was rather early in European terms. The first predictive policing systems go back to around 2008, 2009 in Los Angeles, California. And also the German federal police, they had a relatively earlier system, but both of them were unhappy with it, right? And me being an academic, when I hear somebody being unhappy about the predictive policing system, there's all kinds of literature about data bias, group stigmatization, etc., which comes to mind. But that was actually not the reason they were unhappy with the system. Of course, there was an internal discussion about efficacy. And I really want to stress this point here, because it was one of the main things that I personally learned from the research project. Because as organizations, they had the room to really develop those technologies themselves. And their main problem was that their agents that they actually wanted to use those systems, they didn't use them at all. So there was no pickup within the force. And that was their biggest problem. So they had the system ready, developed, invested resources in it, but nobody was using it to actually catch criminals. And that was one of the things that we ended up thinking a lot in the research project about. So why is that, and actually doing research internally on why that would be the case. And then there are many things which come to mind. So, if agents were actually using those systems, do they have enough literacy about it? There are the general choices that go into visualizing this data, making spatiotemporal, drawing those maps with the spots where the crime is about to happen, etc. All of that is already, of course, a very big simplification, and whether that is good or not. But what we then found out during thinking about the systems and the use of it is actually that there, instead of focusing on the predictive element, there was much more to be gained in thinking about how this data and how what we do with this data can actually be used internally beneficially to improve information sharing. And when you look at the toolkits, and I should mention there, so our specific role, the project had sort of, like from a design perspective, it had sort of diverging elements, where in the beginning we would sit together in a sort of a design workshop setting and then debate about different types of problems, and we would try to bring in the ethical and the human rights types of perspectives. And then later in the step of the project, when it really came to developing the toolkits, it was all about converging elements, so really putting that, and then we've seen the final solutions, but when it came really to the converging element, we as a partner had less influence on that. But what's really interesting is, after having this discussion, that you see in both toolkits, there's really this very strong focus on information sharing, and that is in the instead of on focusing on the prediction, and that is in the German case. In the patrol toolkit, it is all about sharing information between shifts, so what is relevant is not being lost. And in the Dutch case, it was much more about developing a multi-stakeholder model, creating and involving the stakeholders which are relevant to create sustainably security in a sort of environment. And that was very, very, very surprising to me. First, as I mentioned, the aspect what really was the issue from their side, and secondly also the direction which it ended up eventually. And the final point that I'm going to make here is that I think a research project like this, we were of course all in an incredibly privileged position because we had a lot of resources and time to think about this and develop a very broad approach to this. But I think it also tells you a lot about assumptions that coming from all different types of sides when it comes to using this technology, and then really looking what's happening on the ground, what's the problem, and what's the type of direction which actually makes sense in the end. Thank you.
Thank you, Oscar. Now we have brought together, as we said, sectoral approaches, and just to draw a bit of a circle around them, we started with the questions surrounding abnormal justice and the role of groups in data regulatory and AI regulatory spaces, and then we zoomed into a specific group that is a gendered group, and I think there we found very vulnerable aspects where these regulations really touch upon some sore spots that we need to identify in order to better protect. Then we segued into a specific domain that is facial recognition, where Vincent, you outlined very nicely what are the different regulatory aspects that we need to take into account when we are looking into the different vulnerabilities that we are facing. And then we zoomed out to the practitioner's perspective, and we thought, how do police forces, law enforcement agencies view these technologies? How do they interact with them and implement them? And I think that covers pretty much a bit the panel that we've had here. But now I'd like to open the floor. I'd like to welcome also Lynette back onto the screen so that she can join the panel. And I'd like to invite you to ask pertinent questions to how we can further expand, for example, these sectoral approaches. If we can ask the technology. Yes, Lynette is back. Thanks.
Hi, my name's Carrie Lenning, and I'm with Castlebridge in Ireland. I wanted to touch on a point that Vincent mentioned about how we should allow authorities and law enforcement to kind of what sounds like live test on people in terms of detecting and developing the facial recognition features. And I'm not going to lie, that was moderately horrifying to me. What I want to understand is, are we approaching it in the sense that, like, as a kind of a free-for-all, or is there going to be standards and looking at these technologies before they go into the wild? Because it can have profound, legal and freedom effects on people, and in general probably violates a few things in Europe. So I just wanted to kind of touch on that to make sure I just misheard it incorrectly, or if you were actually advocating for this kind of live test approach in general to develop these technologies. Thanks.
So probably, I don't think the mic is working. Yeah, thank you. Probably sitting a bit in the middle between you being totally horrified and you being reassured. What I wanted to mention is I'm alluding to the sandbox part of the AI Act, where we need to define spaces where this technology can be tested so that we know whether they can bring benefits or not, which means an experimentation has a scope, it is limited in time, in space, in purpose. So if we decide that there's going to be an experimentation on a given square sometime in a city, everyone would know about it. The data protection authorities will be part of the supervisory board of that experimentation. We would know beforehand what we want to test, what do we want to know about that technology, what is it that we want to know after the experimentation that we don't know before the experimentation. And we need to have transparency after the experimentation in terms of the results and the conclusions. So,
but sorry,
yeah?
I don't mean to be dismissive about that, but that's great. Don't get me wrong, that's important. But I'm talking about the consequences. We're talking about facial recognition here, potentially to say detect crime or to do something else, where it's going to have...
Face recognition doesn't detect crime.
No, well, sorry, to identify, not detect crime, but to identify where someone who, may be involved in something,
No,
if it was
that's not
them.
what facial recognition does, I'm sorry. Facial recognition, what facial recognition does is that person in front of the camera is that person in the reference database. That's what facial recognition does, and it doesn't even do that.
You used a criminal element. You used a crime example in your slide.
In law enforcement.
In law enforcement, right.
Yeah.
And you specifically called out law enforcement. So I'm not entirely sure what facial recognition is going to be doing, if not in a law enforcement context. I'm
definitely talking about law enforcement here. Maybe just a sentence. There are two use cases where I think facial recognition can help in a law enforcement context, right? One is investigation. There's been a crime, and fortunately, part of that crime has been happening in front of a camera. So you have the perpetrator on camera. You can see the face of the perpetrator on camera. You don't know who that person is. Maybe that person is on file for previous offenses. So maybe you want to identify that perpetrator that has been doing crime in front of a camera, and know who he is, so that you can arrest him and go with the investigation. So that's part of that investigation of trying to understand who were the person involved in a crime that occurred. The second use case would be in a time, and it's more homeland security than law enforcement, in my opinion. Either for looking for missing persons, you would have a reference database of missing persons, and if that person is seen somewhere, then maybe that's important for the investigation on that missing person. And the third one would be if a person is believed to be about to commit a terrorist attack, for example, and there's a very particular event that would be, let's say, where a terrorist attack could happen, then maybe you want to know that that person is there. Mm-hmm. This last one is highly, highly, highly sensitive. I realize that, and it should be framed with the utmost stringency. But these are the use cases we're talking about in terms of law enforcement. Facial recognition does not predict crime, cannot report crime, does not detect crime. It matches an identity on a person. That's what it does.
And I think we are then also moving over to a very interesting domain of citizen scoring and also some other domains that we know from other contexts. I think that we have to sensitively evaluate. Mm-hmm. I'd like to give the floor still to the audience, but I'd like to collect a few questions if that is possible. Please.
Mm-hmm. Is this a problem that is anticipated with facial recognition as well? And what do you think as a technical lead should be ways to actually address it or regulate it?
So I will collect the questions if you don't mind. So the question was about the human evaluation and the biases that are introduced by the human evaluators.
Actually on the development of the technology bit.
And the development of the technology bit. All right, so then the next question.
Hi, I have a few questions actually. I'm Pratham.
Please restrict it to two.
Two questions?
Thanks.
Okay, I'll try to make the most pertinent ones. I'm Pratham, I'm studying Law and Digital Technologies at Leiden. So my first question is with regards to the facial recognition usage in terms of crime investigation. And it is about how do we account for, like, as you stated, there'll be a sandbox where people will be aware of the fact that this technology is being used. However, how do we account for the impact that that knowledge would have on the passive behavior of individuals that are present in that space? And my second question was with regards to predictive policing, and it's guided by the Casteja case as well as the Compass case study. The Casteja case basically being, since it was mentioned that there'll be historic crime data being used to feed data into predictive policing systems. How does that align with an ability of an individual to have their crime records expunged after they've served their time or after they've accounted for it? And with regards to the Compass case study, how do we prevent there being racial biases in said historical crime data in the first place, considering how terribly Compass went?
Hi, my name is Harun. I'm also studying at Leiden University in the same program. There's a few of us, I think, so I'm sorry for...
Great program.
My question was also about predictive policing and then by extension, mass surveillance. I'm sorry to pick on China, but using China as an example, they seem to be developing similar technologies in this sort of space race with the EU and the US, but don't seem to be paying as much mind to perhaps ethical innovation and taking vulnerable populations and things like this into consideration. And then on top of that, there's a very insidious branching out where the Chinese are introducing their surveillance infrastructure into other countries. How, excuse me, how does the more regulated and measured approach that, I use the term we very lightly, that we take to this technology, how do we hope to compete with the speed at which China is developing artificial intelligence if we're going about it this way? Thank you.
And we'll take one last question, then we will do a round. Is that all right?
Hi, my name is Saba, and I'm also from the LDT program at Leiden University. My question is about technicalities of what we would actually define as a facial recognition technology. My thesis focuses on augmented reality face filters, and during my research, I've come to this conclusion that there are systems that do follow facial recognition technology steps in a traditional sense, meaning facial detection via a Viola-Jones algorithm, feature extraction, mesh generation, but they don't put it in a database. They don't put it against another person, so they're not used for verification or authentication. But reading computer sciences papers, I see that in their in the literature, the scholars define different steps involved as facial recognition algorithm. And sometimes I see that there's a maybe misapprehension regarding what's face recognition versus what's facial recognition. And it has great implications for us as scholars, because it means whether the sensitive data clause of the GDPR applies or not. So I'm really curious about how we should define this. Thank you very much.
That is wonderful. So what I will do is I will do a round, and with Vincent, I will end with you, because then you have the final crescendo. Right. Lynette, do you have any perspectives? I think there were some interesting aspects touched specifically regarding the group aspects of these new technologies on predictive policing and facial recognition.
Sure, very, very briefly, because I think this can better be answered by the others. But I think that a question arises as to whether protection is the right framing for this, not solely because of the group issue, because, for instance, the EDPS has reframed itself very much around the possibility of to group scale problems. So I have a lot of faith in data protection to think about this, but not actually act on it. It's not in their brief. This is a democratic level problem and needs to be addressed politically, and instead is getting slightly shifted towards compliance and data protection, and I would be very concerned about that. Not because what is being proposed is necessarily destructive of society. I think we need to see further what it actually entails, but because we don't have the right metrics for this right now. So we need to develop those metrics, and they're not going to be compliance metrics.
Elizabeth.
Thanks, Andre. I'm going to pick up on the issue of the effects of, thank you, of some biometric surveillance upon how one behaves and how one sort of perceives oneself. And I'm doing that through some research I did on children and privacy of surveillance in the school situation. And those children, under 18s, sort of quite young, actually held back on forms of self-expression, what they wore, their interactions with their peers, when they knew that they were being surveilled. Now, whether that actually then goes forward, that becomes a permanent sort of holding back in. But the point that I remember from one of the articles in particular was how that assisted a development of a sense of alienation of us and them. We have to keep ourselves to ourselves, and we cannot share. My second observation about this sort of surveillance and cameras comes from CCTV when I was a former privacy commissioner for 6 years at the state level inside Australia. This happened in a sort of small country coastal town, and where CCTV was actually challenged in our Administrative Appeals Tribunal. And the reasons why people brought this forward is they felt it was an indiscriminate measure which actually potentially was not. There could have been more targeted ways of achieving the purposes for which, the council, I think it was, wanted to achieve, rather than having this camera up without signs saying it was there, and which actually they felt was sort of like Big Brother overlooking their enjoyment, and also too having children, young children there with them. It was on by the seaside, and all the associated activities that go on there. I'm just going to also add something which is only more of a complimentary comment, is that I read an absolutely fascinating article in relation to the question that was, or the issue that was raised about China and this overall geopolitical strive for competition and leadership in the AI race. And it was about the Belts and Road Initiative and how digital infrastructure is being used to actually support and accelerate that AI leadership. I'm sorry, I don't have the details here, but happy to try and find them for you.
All right, so I'm going to talk a bit about the bias in predictive policing. So the first thing to be considering here is which type of data is being used to train the system. And there it starts with the historic crime data. Of course, there can be biases in there regarding to which type of information is collected and how precise is it. But what you have in there is sort of a safeguard, at least from the cases that we've been working on researching, is that there is a pretty strict time limit to it. So I think, I'm not sure how much years they use, but it's not like going 20 years back in time data for having predictions. It's more like 2 or 3 years going back. And then if you're taking a slightly optimistic view on things, you would expect those institutions also to be able to increasingly adapt to the pertinence of this issue, which of course is then a governance question again regarding the internal mechanisms and how well that works and how well it doesn't work. Another element here to think of, which I actually was also not that aware before working on the project, is that regarding to the availability and amounts of data that you have, that predictive policing does not work in all areas of a country very well just because you don't have enough crime data there to train the systems, right? So that also brings an interesting flavor to the whole discussion. And I think here again, this stresses the point that I made during the presentation, that when you talk about the application of this technology in developing the systems, you really need to be considering the context and really what is going on there. Not to say that this technology can have very negative implications and that there's a lot of potential for misuse there, but I think it is very, very important to consider the specific type of context and where that goes. What I find extremely striking and what I think is deeply problematic is that from the original design of those systems, it was not clear from the start which type of evaluation criteria would be used and developed eventually. So there was a very, I would almost call it naive assumption that, we turn the system on, we make the predictions, we send the agents there, crime rates will go down. And of course, that's not how it works, because the underlying phenomenon of crime is much more complicated than that. So for instance, in most Western European countries, when it comes to conventional petty crime, you have declining rates anyways, which has a lot to do with demographic trends. And then there's a whole long debate to be had for criminologists and social scientists on why that is the case. But so there is not a direct correlation there. But still, apart from that, we need to have, when we are designing the system from the start, we need to know what does it mean for us, for the people who are using this, and who are applying this, and ideally who are affected by this, that this system would work or that it doesn't work. And briefly picking up on the affected part, that was also something that we debated a lot within the project. How do you create a community about it? About the whole development and application of the technology, where on the one hand you would still have sort of a trustworthy, let's call it, environment which allows the law enforcement agency to do its job, which is also often or sometimes in a hostile environment when they're actually doing their job. But on the other hand, also where you include enough societal support. And that is actually from all the 4 focus areas, not only from predictive policing within the project, we always came back to the question, so what is, when we're talking about the security community, who should be involved in that, and how can we have these types of discussions to go beyond the individual harm? And I think there's a lot of work to be done there, because this is a really, really complex and tough subject.
And now everyone has also waited for one song.
So how long do I have?
Nobody dared to go to the toilet, so you have to.
Okay.
5 minutes.
Okay, 5 minutes. I've taken some notes regarding algorithm bias. It's a very, very important topic. A lot of the discussion has been about if you're training database is biased in terms of how it represents certain groups of population, then the algorithm was biased. I do not support that assertion in the sense that not only the training data set affects the performance of the algorithm. The basis of AI training is an optimization function that you optimize on the training data set. But that cost function, that optimization, you decide what you want to optimize. And if you want to optimize for accuracy, then maybe you'll have some bias in terms of the algorithm choosing to have more error rates on a certain group of people because the other group of people is more represented in the training data set. It's basically mathematics. But if you add into that cost function into the training elements that do fight bias in the sense that, yes, I want accuracy, but I also want the error rates on these different groups of population to be the same, then you'll have a less biased algorithm. You'll have a less accurate algorithm, mind you, because it's still an optimization problem and you have to make trade-offs. But it's very important to internalize into the development of the algorithm the fact that you don't want that algorithm to be biased. Issue is you have to express the bias that you want to fight against, right? You need to say, these two groups of population, male and female, for example, I want to have the same error rates. If you explicit that, then the algorithm will follow that. These different ethnic groups, I want them to have the exact same error rates. If you explicit that, the algorithm will follow that. There are probably other biases that you did not explicitly address in your cost function that still may be out there in the algorithm. But balancing the training data set itself is not enough. It's been demonstrated in the research papers. You could have a group with 20% male, 80% female as a training data set and still have better performance on male. Okay, it's not enough to balance the data set. You need to actually look at how you optimize your training. And if you do that, you can get very, very, very low bias. And this has been measured, again, by NIST. I can provide the source for anyone who wants it in a ongoing test that they're doing on facial recognition, that the different ethnic demographic groups that they've chosen, they could not measure statistically significant bias on these different groups. For the best performing algorithms also, the worst performing algorithms were biased. That's a reality. The best performing algorithms had so little bias that it wasn't able to measure. Okay, I'll wrap up. The second part is how do we measure impact? We need on experimentation if we use it in a real life setting. We need to design the experiment so that the impact on people is null. It has no impact on people, right? I'm talking about the experiment. And that's the only condition at which we can actually have it in a real life setting. The fact that a person walks in front of a camera and elicits a response from the system or does not elicit a response from the system should have zero impact on that person. And we should be very transparent about that. I think that's the only way we can do this. Also, probably having another organization than a law enforcement organization actually performing the trial could be a good idea to somehow reassure the participants. Another possibility is to have free participation to that, having a closed space, warning people when they get in that if they go in, they'll be part of a trial. But it raises the problem of people wanting to go in and not being subject to the trial. So it's a complicated issue. And I'm sorry, I don't have to address the facial recognition versus face recognition issue, but I'd be happy to discuss it in the break.
I'm sure that there will be people coming towards you and asking you questions. And in order to give that opportunity to Vincent to answer some more questions over coffee, I thank very much Lynette, the panel. I thank the audience for being here. I hope you had a good session. And please give a big hand of applause for our colleagues.